In the previous lesson, we talked about the House of Lords. We examined the general structure, the membership of the House of Lords, as well as the functions of the House of Lords. Now, in this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about how the House of Lords has been reformed in the past, which means examining, for example, the two Parliament Acts of 1911 and 1949, the House of Lords Act of 1999, and then also a number of royal commissions that have proposed further reforms into the future. So seeing where the House of Lords could go in the future as well. So that's essentially what we're going to look at in this lesson. And we should note that the preamble to the 1911 Parliament Act states that its drafters ultimately had the intention to substitute for the House of Lords as it is at present exists, a second chamber constituted on a popular instead of hereditary basis. So even back then, even back in 1911, we are talking about the ways in which we can change, reform, and essentially alternate the institution of the House of Lords into a more democratic, popular-led institution rather than that of a hereditary institution. And in the years since the Parliament Act, reform of the House of Lords has been part of a number of debates, discussions, and also on the agenda of various successive governments, essentially since 1911. So we saw the 1949 Act, and then we've seen the 1999 Act when the Labour governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown succeeded with the constitutional reforms to the House of Lords that removed a number of these hereditary peers. So, given the fact that we spoke in quite a lot of detail about the House of Lords Act of 1911 and the Parliaments Act of 1911 and 1949, let's focus instead about the House of Lords Act, so the more recent piece of legislation that made the major constitutional change in the House of Lords itself. Now, we know already that the House of Lords Act from 1999 had reduced the number of hereditary peers in the second chamber, in the upper chamber, down to 92. So we remember from the previous lesson that a hereditary peer was a peerage title that was given not to a particular person, but more to a family bloodline, if you will, to a particular family, whereby it was passed down as a hereditary title rather than one that somebody earned and then they lost that title when they died. In fact, when they died, it will pass down to their children. That is the idea of a hereditary peer. Incredibly aristocratic, incredibly representative of a noble class that rules the British society. All of these quite distasteful aspects of British government and rich aristocratic members of society. That was really exemplified in this idea of having hereditary peerage. Well, the House of Lords Act removed all but 92 of those hereditary peers. It also established a appointments commission that was responsible for making recommendations to the Prime Minister regarding the appointment of life peers. This is actually really interesting because before, and to an extent even still to this day, the Prime Minister, when they appoint life peers to the House of Lords, could, in all theoretical circumstances, actually just appoint peers who are major donors to their political party, who are friends, who are doing that person a favour, etc., etc., all of the kind of ideas related to corruption. Well, the Appointments Commission actually instead makes recommendations to the Prime Minister in relation to actually appointing appropriate life peers. We've seen in very recent times, in this year, the recommendation on the part of the Secret Service to not appoint a particular life peer who may have ties to the Russian government, but the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson did so regardless, and so it became quite a controversial news story that we have seen in recent months, in fact, at time of recording. Now, in terms of further reforms to the House of Lords, we have seen a royal commission that was established by the Labour governments that to look into essentially the matter of whether or not we should see further reforms under Lord Wakeham. This is the Wakeham report, the Wakeham Commission that we looked at in the previous lesson, and this is essentially just the royal commission on the House of Lords and on the reform of the House of Lords. Its report, quite interestingly titled A House for the Future, was published in January 2000, and it made a number of recommendations that included reforming the second chamber, the House of Lords. So this was in addition to the House of Lords Act of 1999. It said that the House of Lords should act as a quote-unquote constitutional long stop, which ensured that changes are not made to the Constitution without full and open debate and awareness of the consequences. Now, we have seen in recent years that constitutional legislation and the passage and major changes to the Constitution, there is no single set feature of the UK's constitutional arrangement that allows for constitutional reform. Sometimes there are acts of parliament that are considered to be constitutional that are just simply passed through parliament. Sometimes, in fact, we have seen the growing use of referenda for matters of constitutional importance. So, for example, the Scottish independence referendum that took place in 2014, the Brexit referendum, which takes place in 2016. So, it has been becoming increasingly the case that referenda have been utilised to really signal major shifts and changes in constitutional reform. Now, obviously, referenda are not binding onto Parliament, they're not legally binding, but they do direct policy and lead to a change in the law in most cases, like it did with Brexit. And so, in terms of what role the House of Lords can play in major constitutional changes, is one that is a matter of debate, because essentially the question is, how is constitutional reform actually done in the United Kingdom? There's no single set method by which it is reformed. It can be done through a number and various different means, often through changes in the law, correct? But where is the impetus for that change in the law? Is it part of a manifesto pledge, or is it part of a referendum result? Secondly, they said that a reformed House of Lords should be authoritative, but that its authority should not be such that it has the ability to challenge the ultimate democratic authority of the House of Commons. This is an argument that I talked about in the previous lesson that came from the great advocate Lord Panic in relation to why he believed an unelected body like the House of Lords should stay unelected. He argued that it should have a certain amount of authority, but that authority ought to be subordinate to the House of Commons. If they were both elected members, if they were both elected chambers, should I say, then it would give the House of Lords a greater mandate to dig their heels in when it comes to disagreements in relation to policy and to the passage of legislation. And he argued that there is probably a good thing that we have a body that is subordinate to the House of Commons, such that essentially all authority comes from the House of Commons, so that it is only the House of Commons that can dig their heels in because they have a democratic mandate to do so. And then the final thing that mentioned was that it should be broadly representative of British society as a whole. Now, I would argue, and I think many people everywhere in Britain would argue, that this is not the case in relation to the House of Lords. It could be in relation to the House of Lords. You could theoretically elect and appoint anybody to the House of Lords, and you could have a broadly representative scope for membership of the House of Lords, but it does seem to be the case that the House of Lords is composed of individuals from the middle and very much the upper classes within society. There have also been parliamentary debates on matters relating to reforms in relation specifically to the membership of the House of Lords as it pertains to election and to appointments. So, for example, matters such as having a partly elected and partly appointed second chamber, maybe having a 50-50 system where you have some members that are elected, some members that are appointed. There has also been debates within the House of Commons where they have voted in favour, for example, for a full elected, an 80% elected and 20% appointed, and all of these different things have been debated and been voted on and have been discussed within the broader context of the House of Commons. The only reform option to secure a majority in the House of Lords was a fully appointed House of Lords system, which seems to make sense. A bill which provided for a mainly elected second chamber actually passed its second reading by votes of 462 to 124 in the House of Commons. And it was dropped, however, when it became apparent to the government that it would not be able to get an accompanying programme motion passed, which would have determined the timetable for the bill's passage. So we were very, very close to having legislation in place which could have led to a partly, at least, elected member of elected chamber within the House of Lords. But this was not to be.